What would you do if the only thing you could afford was the one thing no one else wanted? If your last $4 had to choose between a hot meal and a broken-down animal, a creature the world had already written off as worthless. For one man, that choice led him not to ruin, but to a treasure beyond anyone's wildest imagination. He paid $4 for a blind stallion bound for the slaughterhouse, a purchase that earned him the scorn of an entire town. But what happened next, in the quiet desolation of the frontier, would prove that sometimes the things we dismiss hold the deepest secrets. Stay close and let this story remind you that the greatest discoveries are often made when we learn to see with more than just our eyes. The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on Ethan Vance like a second skin, a fine grit that worked its way into the creases of his worn coat and the lines around his eyes. He had arrived on foot, leading nothing, carrying less. The town's name was a bitter irony he didn't have the energy to appreciate. There was no redemption here, only the hard, unblinking stare of a place that had seen too many men like him. Men who carried their pasts in the slump of their shoulders and the hollowness of their gaze. He had lost his ranch to the drought, his wife to the fever that followed, and his name to the whispers that blamed him for both. All that remained was a stubborn refusal to lie down and die, and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and chamomile that he sometimes caught on the wind, a ghost of the life he'd once known. He walked the single-planked street, his boots scuffing a rhythm of defeat against the boards. Doors to the mercantile, the smithy, the saloon, they all seemed to close a little tighter as he passed. He sought work, but his hands, though calloused and capable, were attached to a man who looked like a harbinger of bad luck. "Nothing today," the livery owner muttered, not meeting his eye. "Full up," the freight manager said, turning back to his ledger. Each rejection was a quiet, steady blow, chipping away at the small reserve of hope he'd carried into town. He had a few coins left, enough for a stale biscuit and a cup of weak coffee. But hunger was a familiar ache, one he could manage. It was the other hunger, the one for a foothold, for a single square foot of earth that wouldn't crumble beneath him, that gnawed at his soul. That evening, he found himself at the edge of town, where the respectable world frayed into a landscape of broken wagons and discarded dreams. A small, pathetic auction was underway near the knackery, the air thick with the smell of cheap livestock and despair. The auctioneer, a man with a stained waistcoat and a tired voice, was trying to sell off the dregs. It was there, tied to a splintered post, that Ethan first saw him. A stallion, broad-chested and proud, with the clean lines of a thoroughbred. His coat was the color of a midnight storm, matted with mud and burrs, but even in his neglect, there was a power in his stance, a defiant stillness that set him apart from the other broken-down animals. Then Ethan saw his eyes. They were clouded over, two milky orbs that stared into nothing. The horse was blind. A ripple of cruel laughter went through the small crowd. "What's the use of a horse that can't see the trail?" someone called out. The auctioneer sighed. "He's strong, got good bone. Good for stud, maybe, or glue. Let's start the bidding at $10. Silence. The wind whistled through the fence posts. A big, prosperous rancher named Silas Croft, who owned half the valley, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the stallion's hooves. "I wouldn't give you 10 cents for that useless nag. Put him out of his misery." The auctioneer's shoulders slumped. $5 then. "Anyone?" $4, just to cover my time." More silence. The stallion stood unmoving, his head held high as if he could hear every word and refused to let it touch him. In that moment, Ethan saw not a useless animal, but a reflection of himself, discarded, damaged, but with an unbroken spirit. He felt the 4 heavy dollar coins in his pocket. They were his last. He stepped forward, his voice raspy from disuse. $4. The auctioneer's head snapped up. The crowd turned to stare. Silas Croft let out a booming laugh. But the deal was done. Ethan Vance, a man with nothing, had just spent everything he had on a blind horse. The weight of the lead rope in his hand felt less like a burden and more like an anchor in a world that had set him adrift. The laughter of the crowd followed him like a swarm of biting flies, but Ethan Vance didn't look back. He simply took the stallion's lead and walked away from the knackery, his worn-out boots and the horse's unshod hooves kicking up small puffs of indifferent dust. In the fading light, the horse's coat looked less like midnight and more like deep, bruised twilight. He was thinner than Ethan had first thought, the sharp lines of his ribs visible beneath the matted hair. Yet he walked with a strange, unnerving grace, his head up, his ears swiveling constantly, reading the world in a language of sound and vibration that Ethan could only guess at. He placed a hand on the stallion's neck. The muscle beneath was tense but not fearful. There was a deep, quiet intelligence in the animal, a trust given cautiously, but given all the same. Ethan felt a kinship so profound it almost buckled his knees. Here was another soul the world had deemed broken, another creature living in a world it could no longer see, navigating by memory and instinct alone. He decided to call him Shadow, for the way he seemed to move without a sound, a dark, silent form against the dying day. As he led Shadow through the main street of Redemption Gulch, the town's judgment was swift and absolute. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped their conversations on the saloon porch to stare and whisper. Vance's folly, he heard someone mutter, and the name stuck. It became a piece of town lore before he'd even reached the other side. Silas Croft, mounted on a magnificent bay gelding that shone with good health and expensive grooming, trotted up beside them. He looked down from his high saddle, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, Vance?" he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Found yourself a fitting partner, I see. 2 blind fools stumbling in the dark. What are you going to do with him? Teach him to read rocks?" Croft's cronies laughed along with him. Ethan didn't rise to the bait. He met Croft's gaze for a brief, silent moment, his own eyes as hard and unreadable as riverstones, then turned his attention back to the horse, murmuring a low, soothing word. His silence was more potent than any retort. It was a wall Croft's mockery couldn't breach. He simply walked on. Why would a man with nothing spend his last dollar on a horse that couldn't see? What secret did the animal hold in its silent, milky eyes? And what instinct drove a broken man to see value where everyone else saw only a liability? Let us know in the comments what you think was going through Ethan's mind in that moment. And if you're finding a place in your heart for this story, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Because the path this blind stallion would lead him down started not with sight, but with a sound only he could hear. He left the town behind, the whispers and laughter fading into the vast, open silence of the high desert. He walked until the last lamplit window of Redemption Gulch was just a tiny spark behind him. On the far edge of the valley, where the good grazing land gave way to rock and scrub, he found a small, forgotten parcel of land. It was a place nobody wanted, marked by a collapsed lean-to and a choked, dry creek bed that snaked through the property like an old scar. It was here he would make his stand. There was no one to judge him here, only the wind and the sky and the quiet company of his blind horse. As he passed a final, dilapidated cabin set far back from the dusty track, a figure on the porch caught his eye. It was an old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. The town called her Alara, a recluse who spoke more to the crows than to people. She watched him and the horse approach, her gaze lingering not on Ethan, but on Shadow, as they drew level with her gait. Her voice, thin and reedy as a bird's call, cut through the evening air. "Some creatures," she said, her words deliberate and weighted, "see the world not as it is, but as it was meant to be." Ethan stopped. He looked at the old woman, then at his horse. He didn't understand her meaning, but he felt the truth of it settle in his bones. He gave a slow, respectful nod, a gesture of acknowledgement between two people who lived on the margins. Then he continued on, the cryptic words echoing in his mind as he led Shadow onto the barren patch of earth that was now their home. The land was as broken as he was. Jagged rocks pushed up through the thin soil like broken teeth, and the sagebrush grew in stubborn, thorny clumps. The lean-to was little more than a pile of weathered planks and rusted nails, offering no real shelter from the elements. A lesser man would have seen only desolation, a final confirmation of his failure. But Ethan Vance saw something else. He saw a beginning. It was a place where he could be invisible, where he could heal without the prying eyes of the world upon him. He had nothing to lose, which meant he had everything to gain. He spent his first night under the vast, star-dusted sky, with Shadow standing nearby. The horse didn't lie down, but stood a silent, motionless sentinel, his breathing a slow, rhythmic comfort in the profound quiet of the wilderness. Ethan slept fitfully, the hard ground an unforgiving mattress, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel entirely alone. The presence of the animal beside him was a steady, living warmth against the cold loneliness that had been his constant companion. His first priority was not himself, but the horse. He used the last of his energy to clear a small corral of the sharpest rocks, creating a safe space for Shadow to move. He had no money for oats or hay, so he spent hours gathering what little hardy grass he could find, growing in the crevices of the creek bed. He'd learned from his father long ago that you care for your animal before you care for yourself, a principle that was etched into his very being. He found a small spring trickling from a rock formation, the water clean and cold, and led Shadow to it. The horse drank deeply, trusting Ethan's guidance completely. Days were spent in a simple, grueling routine. Ethan would work on the land, clearing stones, pulling brush, his muscles aching with the effort. Shadow would stand nearby, his blindness making him a passive observer, yet his presence was a constant motivation. Ethan began talking to him, not out of foolishness, but out of a deep-seated need for connection. He told the horse about his wife, Sarah, about the color of her eyes and the way she used to hum when she worked in her garden. He spoke of his old ranch, the rolling green hills that were now just a painful memory. The horse would listen, his ears twitching, occasionally turning his head as if to catch every word. It was in these quiet moments of shared existence that Ethan began to notice the true nature of Shadow's senses. The horse's hearing was unnaturally acute. A rock slide miles away would cause his ears to pivot long before Ethan heard the faint rumble. The cry of a hawk circling high overhead would make him lift his head, tracking its movement across the sky as if he could see it perfectly. He navigated their small, rocky camp with an eerie precision, never stumbling, never misjudging a distance. He seemed to have a mental map of the terrain, one he updated with every shift of the wind and every crunch of gravel underfoot. He was not a disabled creature. He was differently abled, his remaining senses heightened to a degree that was almost supernatural. It was a humbling realization. Ethan had bought the horse out of pity, out of a sense of kinship with another broken thing. But as he watched Shadow move through their shared world, he began to suspect that it was the horse who was the whole one, and he who was blind to the deeper truths of their surroundings. The world was speaking in a language he had forgotten how to hear, but Shadow understood every word. A week bled into the next, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. Ethan's hands grew raw, then healed into a tougher layer of callus. His body, once weakened by grief, grew lean and hard with labor. He had managed to trade a day's work clearing a path for a neighboring homesteader, a man as poor and reserved as himself, for a sack of flour and some beans. It was meager sustenance, but it was enough. Throughout it all, Shadow was his shadow, a constant, quiet companion. It was during one of these long, monotonous evenings that the horse's strange ritual began. As the sun dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Shadow would stop whatever he was doing, be it grazing on sparse grass or dozing in the sliver of shade cast by a large boulder, and walk with deliberate steps to the far end of their small property. He would always stop in the exact same spot, a flat, dusty patch of ground right before a sheer rock face that formed the northern boundary of the land. There, he would stand perfectly still, his body aligned with the rock, and lower his head until his muzzle was just inches from the ground. His ears, those incredible instruments of perception, would angle forward, twitching minutely, aimed directly at the base of the stone wall. He would stay like that for 10, sometimes 15 minutes, as motionless as a statue carved from obsidian. He seemed to be listening, not to the world outside, but to something deep within the earth itself. The first few times it happened, Ethan paid it little mind. Animals had their quirks, their strange habits born of instinct and repetition. He thought perhaps the horse was sensing water deep underground, or maybe the vibrations of some nocturnal creature burrowing beneath the surface. He went to the spot himself, knelt down, and pressed his own ear against the cool, rough surface of the rock. He heard nothing. There was only the low moan of the wind coursing through the valley and the faint, high-pitched ringing of his own exhaustion. He patted Shadow's neck, murmured, "Nothing there, boy," and led him back toward their camp. But the horse was insistent. Every single evening, without fail, as the light began to fade, he would repeat the journey. The ritual never varied by an inch or a second. It was precise, methodical, and deeply focused. Ethan started to watch more closely, his curiosity piqued by the animal's unwavering conviction. This was not a random act. It was intentional. There was a purpose to it that he couldn't yet fathom. The rock face itself was unremarkable, a sheer wall of granite and sandstone, no different from 100 other formations in the valley. But to Shadow, it was a place of immense significance. It was a focal point, a destination. One evening, a coyote howled from a nearby ridge, a sound that usually sent Shadow's ears swiveling in its direction. But while he stood at his listening post, he didn't even flinch. His entire being was concentrated on the silent rock in front of him. What was he hearing? What secret did the earth hold in this one specific place that only a blind horse could perceive? The question settled in Ethan's mind, a small, persistent seed of wonder. He didn't have an answer, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of something other than loss. He felt a mystery beginning to unfold. the seed of wonder planted by Shadow's ritual began to grow. Ethan's life was still a matter of pure survival, a daily struggle for calories and warmth. But now it had a new focus. His labor, once a simple act of clearing land, became an investigation. He started working his way methodically across the property, moving from the collapsed lean-to toward the rock face at the northern edge. Each stone he moved, each root he tore from the dry soil, felt like turning a page in a book he didn't know he was reading. Shadow was always there, a silent supervisor. The horse would stand off to the side, out of the way of the swinging pickaxe and the flying debris, his posture calm and patient. But Ethan noticed that as his work brought him closer to the mysterious rock wall, Shadow's demeanor would shift subtly. The horse would become more attentive, his stillness charged with a kind of anticipation. His ears would remain fixed on the spot where Ethan was digging, tracking the sound of his tools striking the earth. As he cleared the ground within 20 yards of the rock face, Ethan began to notice small anomalies. The composition of the soil changed. It became softer, less compacted, with a strange, bluish-green tinge in the dirt that stained his hands. The rocks he pulled from the ground here were different, too. They weren't the plain granite and sandstone that littered the rest of the property. Many were laced with faint, delicate veins of turquoise and a deeper, more vibrant blue he didn't recognize. He wasn't a prospector, but he'd lived in the West long enough to know the land sometimes held secrets in its colors. He set a few of the more interesting stones aside, his curiosity growing with each one he unearthed. He was still driven by the practical need to create a small patch of arable land for a garden, but a new, more compelling question now drove him. What was buried here? One sweltering afternoon, he was wrestling with a particularly large, deeply embedded boulder about 10 feet from the base of the wall. He had been digging around it for an hour, the sun beating down on his back, sweat stinging his eyes. He swung his pickaxe, aiming for the earth beneath the rock to loosen its hold. Instead of the familiar grating crunch of steel on stone, the tool hit with a dull, resonant thud. It was the sound of metal striking wood. He froze, his arms trembling with exertion. The sound was wrong. Wood had no business being buried this deep, not here. He looked over at Shadow. The horse, who had been dozing lightly in a sliver of shade, was now wide awake. His head was high, his ears locked forward, pointed directly at the spot where the pickaxe had landed. A low, guttural nicker rumbled in his chest. It wasn't a sound of alarm, but of confirmation. In that instant, the pieces clicked into place in Ethan's mind. The horse's nightly ritual, the strange soil, the colored rocks, and now this. Shadow hadn't just been listening to the earth. He had been listening to this. He had been guiding Ethan to this exact spot all along, with a patience and wisdom that defied all logic. A surge of adrenaline cut through his fatigue. He dropped to his knees and began to dig with his bare hands, clawing at the dirt around the point of impact, his heart hammering against his ribs. The earth was about to give up its secret. The sun began its slow descent, but Ethan barely noticed. He worked with a feverish intensity, his earlier exhaustion forgotten. He scraped away the dirt and rock, revealing the source of the thud. A heavy, rough-hewn wooden beam, its surface dark and warped by time and moisture. It wasn't just a random piece of timber. It was part of a larger structure. Following its line, he dug a trench, his hands raw and bleeding, his muscles screaming in protest. He unearthed another beam, then another, forming a crude, rectangular frame. It was a doorway, a collapsed entrance to a mine shaft, deliberately and carefully buried under tons of rock and soil. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide this place, to erase it from the landscape. He paused, leaning on his shovel, breathing heavily. He looked at the hidden entrance, then back at Shadow, who stood watching him, his silhouette dark against the vibrant sunset. The horse had led him here. The quiet, broken creature he had saved from death was, in fact, his savior. With the last of his strength, he used his pickaxe as a lever, prying at the rotted timbers that blocked the entrance. They groaned in protest, then splintered and gave way, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A rush of cool, stale air washed over him, smelling of deep earth, dampness, and something else. A faint, metallic tang, like the air after a lightning strike. He retrieved his lantern, his hands shaking slightly as he struck a match and lit the wick. The small flame cast a flickering, golden glow, pushing back the oppressive darkness. Taking a deep breath, he ducked his head and stepped across the threshold, leaving the world of sunlight and wind for the silent, waiting belly of the earth. The shaft was small and crudely dug, clearly the work of one person. It descended at a gentle angle for no more than 20 feet before ending in a small, cavernous chamber. He raised the lantern high, its light dancing across the walls, and then he saw it. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a vein of gold or a seam of silver. It was something far more beautiful. The back wall of the chamber was a breathtaking tapestry of color. A massive, solid vein of rock shot through with brilliant streaks of sky blue, deep azure, and vibrant sea green, pulsed in the lamplight. It looked as if a piece of the summer sky had been trapped underground. He had never seen anything like it. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cool, smooth surface. It was turquoise and azurite, but of a purity and concentration that was legendary. The kind of find old prospectors whispered about around campfires, but never truly believed existed. On a small hand-carved shelf in the rock beside the vein sat a small rust-eaten tin box. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a slim, leather-bound journal. The ink was faded, the handwriting a spidery scrawl, but it was legible. It was the diary of a prospector named Jedediah Stone, dated 50 years prior. It told the story of his solitary search, his discovery of this incredible vein, and his overwhelming fear of claim jumpers. He had hidden the mine's entrance, planning to return and file a proper claim. But the journal's entries grew erratic, speaking of a fever and a growing weakness. The final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, read, "The earth here sings a blue song, if you know how to listen for it. I fear I am the only one who ever will." Ethan closed the journal, his heart full. He looked back toward the mine's entrance, where the silhouette of his blind stallion stood, patiently waiting. Jedediah had been wrong. Someone else had heard the song. Just as the weight of the discovery settled upon him, the world outside began to change. The sky, which had been clear and painted with the gentle colors of dusk, had turned a bruised, menacing purple. The wind, once a low whisper, began to howl, whipping dust and debris against the rock face. A storm was coming, one of those sudden, violent tempests that could appear out of nowhere in the high country. Ethan felt a deep unease. His first instinct was to protect the mine. An unprotected shaft like this could flood in minutes, the torrents of water turning it into a muddy, impassable grave, potentially collapsing the entire structure and burying the vein forever. He scrambled out of the entrance just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, cold and heavy. The air crackled with electricity, and a distant roll of thunder echoed through the valley. a low growl that promised violence. He worked with a desperate urgency, his body screaming with a fatigue that went bone deep. Using broken timbers from the old lean-to and piles of rock he'd already excavated, he started building a crude diversion wall, a barrier to channel the inevitable rush of water away from the mine's entrance. The rain came down in sheets, plastering his hair to his scalp and turning the dusty ground into a slick, treacherous mud. Shadow stood nearby, unbothered by the storm, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos of the elements. He seemed to trust Ethan implicitly, standing as a quiet anchor in the swirling wind and rain. The dry creek bed at the edge of the property was already beginning to fill, transforming from a dusty scar into a shallow, gurgling stream. Ethan knew that soon it would become a raging river. He had to work faster. It was then, through the gray, watery curtain of the downpour, that he saw it, a flickering lantern bobbing and swaying wildly in the distance down by the main track. He heard a faint shout, nearly swallowed by the roar of the wind, followed by the terrifying splintering of wood. He squinted, trying to pierce the gloom. A wagon, caught in the flash flood that was now consuming the road, had overturned. He didn't hesitate. The mine, the treasure, all of it faded into the background. There were people in trouble. He grabbed his lantern and called to Shadow, his voice tight with urgency. "Stay here, boy." The horse let out a soft whinny, as if in understanding. Ethan slid and scrambled his way through the mud and rising water toward the wreck. He found a horrifying scene. A heavy farm wagon lay on its side, one wheel shattered. A man was pinned underneath, his face pale with pain, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. A woman, clearly pregnant, was trying frantically to free him, while a small child, no older than 4, sat crying in the mud, soaked and terrified. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, Ethan helped the woman, whose name was Mary Miller, dig the earth from around her husband. Together, they managed to pry the wagon up just enough for him to drag his crushed leg free. The man, John, was barely conscious. The storm was worsening, the floodwaters rising dangerously. Their meager belongings were being swept away. "We have to get to higher ground," Ethan yelled over the wind. "My place. It's not much, but it's dry." He half-carried, half-dragged John Miller, while Mary clutched their child, and they stumbled their way back toward his camp. He led them not to his own exposed sleeping spot, but to the one place he knew was safe and dry, the mouth of the mine. He settled them inside, just beyond the entrance, protected from the wind and the deluge. He gave them his only dry blanket, built a small, smoky fire with the few pieces of dry wood he had, and used strips torn from his own shirt to splint the man's leg. He had almost nothing, but what he had, he gave freely. All through the night, as the storm raged, Ethan Vance stood guard at the entrance, a solitary figure protecting a family of strangers, his blind horse a silent partner in his vigil. He had been tested, and he had chosen compassion over fortune without a second thought. By morning, the storm had broken. A weak, watery sun filtered through the clouds, illuminating a world washed clean and battered. The creek was still swollen, but had receded from its furious peak. John Miller was awake, his face tight with pain, but his eyes clear with gratitude. His wife, Mary, sat holding their sleeping child, looking at Ethan with an expression of profound thankfulness that made him feel both humbled and awkward. "We owe you our lives," she said, her voice soft but firm. Ethan just shook his head, murmuring that he'd done what anyone would have. As he helped John into a more comfortable position, the surveyor's professional eye caught the glint of the vein at the back of the small cavern. His eyes widened, first in curiosity, then in utter disbelief. He had worked in this region for years, mapping its contours and studying its geology. He knew the legends, the old tales of a lost mine filled with sky-colored stone. "My God," he whispered, his own pain forgotten for a moment. Is that what I think it is? The lost azure?" Word traveled as fast as the receding floodwaters. Once Ethan had helped the Millers right their wagon and secure it. John insisted on being taken into Redemption Gulch for a proper doctor. He refused to leave, however, until he had shaken Ethan's hand and promised to send help. The story he told in town was not of a treasure discovery, but of a quiet, selfless man who had sheltered his family from the storm of the century. The narrative of Vance's folly began to crumble. The town doctor, a practical man named Elias Rowe, came out to the property to tend to Ethan's own cuts and bruises after setting John's leg. He saw the mine, and his professional skepticism gave way to quiet awe. He returned to town and went straight to the assayer's office. Soon, a small, reverent procession began to make its way to Ethan's land. It wasn't a mob of gold seekers, but a community humbled and intrigued. The assayer, a meticulous man with spectacles perched on his nose, took samples from the vein. He performed his tests right there, by the light of a lantern, his silence drawing the small crowd of townspeople closer. Finally, he looked up, his expression one of pure astonishment. "It's the real thing," he announced, his voice carrying in the quiet air. "Turquoise and azurite of a grade I've never seen. Not in any book, not in any ledger. This vein, it will make this valley famous." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. They turned to look at Ethan, who stood quietly by the mine's entrance, his hand resting on Shadow's neck. They saw not a fool or a failure, but a man of impossible patience and quiet strength. The last to arrive was Silas Croft. He rode his fine horse right to the edge of the property, his face a mask of thunderous disbelief. He saw the expertly timbered entrance to the mine, work the grateful John Miller had already arranged. He saw the respectful faces of the townspeople, and he saw Ethan, standing not with arrogance, but with a simple, unshakable dignity. Their eyes met across the distance. Croft's arrogance finally broke. Without a word, he turned his expensive gelding around and rode away, defeated not by a show of force, but by the quiet, undeniable truth of what a $4 blind horse had found. The light of late afternoon slanted across the valley, turning the dust to gold and the distant mesas to shades of amber and rose. A sense of peace had settled over the small patch of land that Ethan Vance now called home. The mine was registered, the claims secured. John Miller, his leg healing, had used his surveyor's knowledge to ensure every legal requirement was met, his gratitude taking the form of meticulous paperwork. A steady stream of visitors had come and gone, geologists from distant cities, investors with quiet offers, and journalists eager for the story of the blind stallion and the lost mine. Ethan had met them all with the same quiet courtesy and an unwavering refusal to sell. He wasn't interested in their money. He was interested in stewardship. His one true friend from his old life, a freighter named Ben, had arrived with a wagon full of proper tools and supplies, having heard the news from a traveler. Ben was a plain-spoken man who had never lost faith in Ethan. He now stood beside him, looking at the mine entrance. "Never doubted you, Ethan," Ben said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Not for a minute. So what's the plan? You're the richest man in this territory now. Gonna build a mansion?" Ethan smiled, a rare, small upturning of his lips. He looked out over the land he had worked with his own 2 hands, the land that had nearly broken him and then had saved him. Shadow stood beside him, as he always did, his head resting gently on Ethan's shoulder in a familiar gesture of affection and trust. The horse's milky eyes saw nothing, but he seemed to feel the warmth of the setting sun, the contentment of his owner, the deep rightness of this place. Ethan ran a hand along the stallion's powerful neck, the coarse hair familiar and comforting beneath his calloused fingers. The sounds of the evening were settling in, the chirp of crickets, the distant call of a quail. This was his fortune, more so than any blue stone buried in the earth. It was the quiet, the peace, the sense of belonging he had thought was lost to him forever. He had arrived in Redemption Gulch with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of ghosts. Now he had a home, a purpose, and a companion whose loyalty was more precious than any mineral. He looked at Ben, his gaze clear and steady, and finally gave voice to the truth he had been learning all along. It was never about what was in the ground, he said, his voice low and certain. It was about learning to trust what the world throws away. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet faith and hidden value. It's a powerful reminder that true worth isn't always what glitters, but is often found in the courage to care for the things that others have discarded. If this tale of patience and perception resonated with you, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more stories that dig beneath the surface. Our next journey takes us to a dusty attic, where a forgotten letter rewrote the history of an entire town. We hope you'll join us.